Over 16,000 research grants are frozen, $2.2 billion are stalled. And what's going on with NIH funding?
People are calling it a crisis. Science thrives off momentum. It very much is a US-based thing.
We are really trying to make inroads for decentralized science. It's really just alternative ways of funding and collaborating around research. When I first read about the indirect costs, what I've realized, it's really bad. Made a lot of people really quickly have to figure out new ways to keep their research moving forward, to honestly keep their labs from going dark.
You actually need these academic sites to be able to run the wet lab experiments.
These funding cuts matter because you are the one who's ultimately going to benefit from the science being done. Over 16,000 research grants are frozen, $2.2 billion are stalled, and most people don't even know that this is happening. Today, we're unpacking what's going on with NIH funding, why it's so complicated, and what it means for science. Aaron, you have been on the ground with this. What exactly is happening?
People have lost for answers. It is, people are calling it a crisis. There's a huge degree of uncertainty. Science thrives off momentum and having procedural certainty in terms of what you're doing. That is the nature of discovery. People are grasping for answers. And so, I've had discussions with a variety of governmental bodies, other types of advocacy bodies, universities, researchers, et cetera. And, people are sort of grasping for answers. I've got to say, it's pretty consistent with an overall sentiment across industry and across markets itself. But, some of those industries are very used to elements of uncertainty and volatility, whereas here, it's a foundational part of, the government apparatus. And so, this is really, really a first time, and people don't know how and where resolution effectively comes through.
Yeah, you said a lot there, and there's a ton I want to unpack. I guess before we get into it, I would love to give you a floor just to intro yourself a bit, share a bit about your background and, why you are so the right person to speak on this.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to speak. Aaron Weaver, I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Molecule. I've spent a number of years working in venture capital, a lot on the life sciences side, where I was out advocating for emerging sort of therapeutic areas. So one predominantly was psychedelic medicine, also a shift to preventative health and longevity, and also helped put money behind a number of sort of emerging technology areas. So whether I'll sort of bring computer interfaces, some aspects of synthetic biology. So I'm familiar with working with early stage research in academia and trying to make these ideas come to life. I recently joined Molecule because I saw the huge promise in DeSci, and one of the things that really drew me towards it was the fact that there is a broader engagement of the general public, and you're sort of bridging that understanding with science and its fundamental merits to the advancement of humanity, like economic causes and social causes. And that in itself, I think, was very much a mission to get on board with.
Yeah, and for me, one thing that I firmly believe is when you take a step back and look at the macro environment, we are really trying to make inroads for decentralized science. And for people who don't know what that means, to me, it's really just alternative ways of funding and collaborating around research. And we're going to get into it on this episode, but there's a lot going on with research funding. Anyone who's super close to the industry knows that it was hard before, and it just got a whole lot harder. And so for us at Molecule, if there was ever a good time, it's absolutely now for looking at open and new ways to fund research. And so, yeah, I'm excited to have you on board, honestly, and to be making inroads into academia and into more traditional science because they need it now more than ever. But let's get into it. So when we talk about funding, the funding challenges, Aaron, is this global or is this I know we've heard a lot about NIH funding. There's certainly a lot going on in the US. I don't want to speak in a way that we're only talking about the US if there's broader implications, but would just love to hear what is causing the funding issues? Is it global or is it, more country specific?
In reference to the NIH funding freezes, it very much is a US based thing. But I mean, having said that, previously, if you're an entrepreneur within the sort of US biomedical research ecosystem, I was an outsider. I was based in the United Kingdom. I participated in funding a lot of research going in and the development of a lot of biotechnology programs. You'd sort of view it as a privileged ecosystem, extraordinary researchers, great sort of academic outposts and, very vibrant venture capital economy that sort of helps support all of these innovations and, very well-versed and understanding participants within the market. But I mean, from a global perspective, it is also something I'm just sort of stepping back the DeSci lens. I've heard the call over and over again from various government representatives, people that are involved in aspects of academia or just fundamental research, that there is just a deep desire for the application of more research dollars because the ideas exist. There just is an inequity, they think, in terms of the way that effectively the funding dollars get to them. But, sort of coming back full circle to effectively what's going on in the United States at the moment, the global healthcare system sort of looks towards the United States for stewardship. It sets the biomedical research precedents. It establishes a lot of the new drug modalities and, the standards of care in which the rest of the medical establishment, whether it be healthcare systems, drug regulators, and things of the sort, effectively look to the US for its thought leadership in its degrees of and developed practice. So, it very much is the gold standard for the way that things are effectively done. So, what we're sort of effectively witnessing here is that you are now caught in this sort of this limbo in terms of the advancement of new scientific ideas, new scientific research, and areas of advancement, and that has a spillover effect to the way that the rest of the world does things. I mean, in some respects, there are other territories that I hear that think that there is opportunity in crisis, and that can also be for other types of alternative funding models. But, the instability as a whole is not great.
Yeah. A lot of the headlines that I've been reading, and maybe you can explain this for our audience, there was NIH implications, but it seemed like it was more focused on like operational costs and operational freezes. Can you speak to that? Like, how would operational costs impact research and what research is being done?
Yeah, I mean, the big bone of contention here is effectively indirect costs that are being charged through by universities. So there have been certain posts it went through, say, for example, the Department of Government Efficiency, which have sort of highlighted what they believe to be exorbitant indirect costs that are being passed through in terms of research. And so that's fallen slightly into basically a political domain. So the resultingly, what's effectively happened is that the current administration has imposed a 15% cap on indirect expenses. Now, going a little bit into the minutiae of that is just that it's understood that universities previously had went and directly negotiated those indirect costs. And so there is a degree of variability between what certain schools are able to claim in terms of indirect costs. And so I believe the average roughly to be about 20 to 27% out of most US universities. I mean, there is, I would say also as a private markets or investment participant, funding a series of R&D companies that have thresholds that you would look at in terms of overall G&A contribution and what goes fundamentally research. And even the SEC has that in terms of companies that will file and the distinction between an emerging growth company and an investment company. But this has become a significant matter of contention. And as you might have recently, I mean, this was a little bit of a newsbreak from yesterday that, Harvard had effectively decided to fight the ask for a degree of supervision and review over teaching curriculum and oversight in terms of the expense base right through the university. And so, that has sort of now threatened $2.2 billion of federal funding that effectively goes into the university. And so, there is, what I say at the moment is there seems to be an apparent degree of turmoil. People don't know how they're relevantly positioned. So you have the administrations of various universities convening boards, setting up task force to effectively understand what's the current state of play, what other alternatives do they have in terms of being able to keep on progressing the various types of programs that they have. And, I think that a lot of them are just, they're finding it challenging. It's just inherently a struggle at the moment. What it really highlights to me, and this was actually mentioned to me by a friend who sits on the board of the School of Engineering of a very, very famous university in the US, was she was asked to lead a task force for that university. They came back around full circle after consideration and just said, we just have to get more philanthropic grants. And, that's also a really challenging thing, because particularly in a time of crisis where the market is also in a very challenged position, the levels of benevolence and sort of and the way and how donors feel philanthropically about certain causes retracts because they're under financial pressure too. And so it just has this exacerbating effect on core fundamental research.
Yeah, it's so interesting. When I first read about the indirect costs, honestly, as someone who doesn't know the inner workings of the system, to me, it was like, oh, feel more like operational costs, more like administrative costs, things that could be scaled back. And what I've realized, and what I'm sure was glaringly obvious to a lot of people, is without those indirect operational costs, you cannot operationalize the science. And so you're basically asking people to continue doing the research without the operational money to do it. And that cannot be. You can't run effectively like a business without the operational overhead to do it. So, to me, what I thought and originally when I was reading about the headlines, I didn't understand, honestly, oh, how bad could it be? And to your point, it's really bad. It's, made a lot of people really quickly have to figure out new ways or new models to keep their research moving forward, to honestly keep their labs from going dark. And that's, to me, when you think about science and the role that science plays for all of us, certainly in a time of new policy and policy changes, there will be change. But the one thing I feel like we could all agree that we don't and can't afford to have hanging in the balance is science.
Yeah, I agree. It's the core of economic productivity. It's the core of advancement of social inequities. If you, I remember a while ago, I was preparing a presentation and got ChatGPT just outline the 20 greatest achievements of the 20th century. And they're all fundamentally scientific discoveries, right? Yeah. And so then 10 of them were matters of curing disease. And so you sort of extrapolate particularly into the advancement of healthcare and the treatment of disease at the moment. 99% of US FDA drug approvals originated from NIH funding. So the whole advancement in the whole, so basically the whole advancement in, the progress of the human health condition and saving and fighting off diseases has a core fundamental being or its origins are sort of set within this ecosystem. And
so Aaron, wait, could we dig into that a bit? Because I feel like that's something that people maybe wouldn't have full context for. You hear of, biotech companies, you hear of big pharma, you hear of more the private sector and there being a ton of money there. And then, contrast that with the NIH, how research and science is actually being done. So maybe you could dig into that a bit more, the role that the NIH actually plays in bringing new medications, new product, new research to market outside of the private sector, how that works.
Yeah, I'm happy to dig into that a little bit more. And it's also, one thing I'd probably say is this is also just broadly the case of academia beyond biomedical research and the sciences. The revolution in generative AI actually came out of universities too. Through and things whether it's GPS and just foundational technologies that we have, but scientific progress at its very origins is, I would say, very fragile. It needs time. It needs a deep degree of understanding, and so it needs a little bit of protection from those commercial or public market pressures. And so allows these ideas to effectively mature. And that foundational research, particularly in the biomedical research field, it will set out a foundational understanding of the various aspects of biology and the pathophysiology, so those aspects of physiology that implicated in disease. And so then you can start to understand, like, what's going on? Why is that happening? When is it effectively going to happen? Is there something that we can effectively do about it? And as you start to piece that picture together, then you start to figure out, like, what are the relevant commercial applications of this? Because at least from a biomedical research perspective, it can go a variety of different ways. We always think about curing diseases, but there are different ways to be able to achieve clinical outcomes and get people to actually manage, or at least even be diagnosed with conditions. So it can be matters from enhancing the prospects for diagnosis, to finding like various methods of treatment. You can have earlier degrees of intervention. You can have symptom modifying drugs. You can have drugs that actually prospectively have a curative effect. But this all really, really starts with a core foundational idea of actually what's going on and what can fundamentally help it. And then it translates into the commercial realm.
So just kind of playing that back, without the NIH funding, it almost feels like you're missing a bit of like the launch pad, because you don't have that foundational knowledge, that foundational research to then build a commercialization strategy on top of, or commercialization pipeline on top of. And without that, you're actually shifting that research funding and research that would need to be done to someone else. But today, the NIH funding is really serving that, foundational knowledge, early research to then ultimately get it to translation by the private sector.
Yeah, that's right. And probably the other thing I'd add around that is it gives you the liberty to be able to do things a little bit more flexibly and go towards certain areas. Whereas if you're a pharmaceutical company or you're another type of technology company, you're known for doing one particular type of thing. You have a core domain of competency. And so you sometimes you're presented with the innovator's dilemma, which is like, do you really want to innovate to effectively erode a degree of market dominance? But, that is a necessary function within pharma because of patent cliffs and the fact that you've got 20 years statutory economic protection on the therapies that you effectively develop. But what it may not necessarily provide within at least within a broader, big commercial context, it may not be able to provide is the next paradigm shift, the next groundbreaking thing. Like you look at like the invention of CRISPR, you look at mRNA, these things, they came out of universities and like at their origins, they were considered really radical ideas. They challenged the conventional norms at those points in time, but they had enough core community and scientific support that they could, actually prosper and develop from a scientific perspective. Like it just works a little bit differently when you have large organizational constraints and incentives that effectively sit on top of like foundational R&D.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think for us, even when you think about like COVID, for example, like where some of the early, vaccine research came from, and then it was picked up and distributed by a pharmaceutical company. It didn't originate within there, but they went and kind of sourced that knowledge and then brought it to the masses. So, we must, bottom line is that's where that foundational knowledge is coming from. And we have to protect that breeding ground for science, or else, I would argue that we're radically vulnerable there, because no one else will be doing it. Aaron, one thing that, in terms of the funding freezes and more of even like the news you brought up yesterday with Harvard, when you're thinking about who is affected by these cuts, is it all of academia, or are there certain, universities or certain types of universities that are more affected than others? Or is it one size fits all that everyone, just across the board, if you're a university that was doing research, you're feeling this?
That there is some degree of selectivity to the way it's effectively occurring. It is partly a matter of political endeavor, but for the most part, it is just the awarding of new grants, right? So like where prospectively grants might be awarded, but the funding hasn't been actually appropriated and passed through. So, there has been a rollover and renewal some elements of research. But yet again, this is the matter of scientific discovery and advancement. So, who really gets hurt there is the new generation of scientists, the ones that are presenting new ideas. I'd probably also say this comes at this pivotal point of technology convergence when we are now seeing some pretty extraordinary computational means of being able to figure things out with AI and getting this understanding of biology. And this is where, at least in my with my own perspective, I see some of the great advancements with making artificial intelligence available as curing human disease and being able to deal with some of these bigger problems. There's an overall constraint on that, which is that's a world of bits. You're trying to make predictions and develop things around the world of atoms. And so you actually need that. You need these academic sites to be able to run the wet lab experiments and to be able to progress things, synthesize the drugs that they effectively need, to be able to validate all of that. But in terms of just broader understanding, inference, and insight, we are at a much better space. But who are the people that can actually pick up these tools and really, really run with them? There is a belief that that the younger generations and the ones that are now getting the grants are the ones that are going to be able to push all of these discoveries forward.
Yeah. It's interesting too. In terms of reading the headlines, I think a lot of times what people don't think about is the people on the other side of those headlines. So I know even from my perspective, I have some friends whose profession, they're professors in academia. And I've actually had a few friends who are currently on a extended leave because they don't know when their research is going to be funded, what's going to happen to their lab. And so, it's even causing not only when you think about it on a macro level, what happens to the research, it's a largely personal impact too. What happens to the people who woke up and all of a sudden now their lab is, at risk. They don't know financially what they're going to do for their family. Do they need to be looking for, I would imagine the job market in the United States for researchers, all of a sudden, there's a ton of people that would be displaced. So then you kind of think about the trickle down effects of that. Where are those people looking for jobs? Where are those jobs going? Are they going, are other countries putting together programs to bring that talent? So I think even as we think about the headlines at the highest level, there are big number impacts, but then when you pull it down to an individual level, honestly, what I feel we lose sometimes is that there are people on the underside of those numbers, and there is real impact to at a personal level.
Yeah, it's I think it's an unfortunate situation that's really unfolding. If I look at what is the power of the U.S. economy, and it's just got an unparalleled ability to effectively innovate. At the core of that is some of its world-leading universities, and what is the prized intellectual output that effectively comes out of those. I'd sort of argue that on one side you've got computer science and data science, which has given rise to the tech giants and some of the artificial intelligence companies, and then you have the bioengineering and the biomedical research schools that are pushing out the other side of that. And so with a lot of the policy disruption going on at the moment, and we've only just been talking about NIH freezes, but there has been restaffing across HHS, which is the Health and Humanitarian Services Department. So big changes at the FDA. The FDA is the gold standard for effectively drug approvals. It has this I'd say very rigid but very thoughtful oversight of drug approvals, so ensuring that they are safe and that they're actually also they can treat disease in the way that they actually profess to do that at scale. And that is an extraordinary complicated process of review, and that does actually require a substantial amount of evidence. And once that system starts to get disrupted, and you're talking about the trickle through effect to job displacement and having a lot of these really, really skilled people, researchers, etc. One of the things that I have heard, the questions that I've heard from the street, people I know on Wall Street, VCs, big company CEOs, etc., is do we take our business somewhere else? We go to another drug regulator? Do we set up in another territory? There are people that are effective. I mean, now this is really becoming a conversation, whereas previously people only just looked to developing these for the United States. They knew and they understood the markets, and then you would actually like expand territorially. But now it's just opened up such a degree of operating uncertainty that people they're unsure.
Yeah. You know, it really is like when you think about the commercialization of a new drug, there is a ton of strategy that goes into that. And like you said, a lot of times today that engine is designed around the US regulatory system, and then the strategy is thought about more broadly. But yeah, to your point, if that whole system is being disrupted a bit at the moment, you know, how do you think about strategically your business in the near term? And does that change your go-to-market strategy for new products in your pipeline? And it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. And honestly, so many of those decisions are made years in advance. And so I spent some time working for a pharmaceutical company, and those strategies honestly are set. A ton of intentionality is set years in advance. And it will be interesting to see too how quickly they can pivot if they need to, because, you know, they've shown, in the COVID world that there needs to be some flexibility and agility in those big processes. But even what agility means in the tech world versus some of those systems is very different. So it'll be really interesting to see, if forced to pivot, how quickly they can and what that looks like, because those systems have been in place for a really long time, and entire companies, processes, and internal systems are built around the systems that they're feeding into, the FDA, like you said, the NIH, where the research comes from. So that'll be something I'm curious to see, at least if it comes down to that, how quickly it can play out. So I want to say too, even jumping back to like word on the street. So I know you spent some time, speaking with folks. I would love to hear, just in general, like a little bit more about what the sentiment is, or even like, are there things that people are doing to try and, explore alternative strategies or push back on some of the funding challenges, or, what are these universities doing? This certainly happened to them, but I'm sure that there's a bit of like, okay, so what do we do now that people are doing?
Yeah, it's, that's an interesting question. And I think it's also something that a lot of the universities sort of stumbling over at the moment is like, what are viable alternatives? Because you have fundamentally the grant funding that comes through. You've got charitable donations that come through a variety of donor groups. And then you've got the venture capital ecosystem predominantly. So I'll probably talk about the VC side of things just for a little bit, is that, the VC market has had a significant pullback over the last 3 years. And, interest rate environment changed significantly. And that meant that there was a change in risk allocations, and it changed in a way that venture companies are expected to be built. And that was premised towards hyperscaling and huge degrees of growth. There wasn't a core focus on profitability and cash flow sustainability within these entities. And so it did cause a lot of disruption within the venture ecosystem. The knock-on effect of that is that it caused even more damage to the biotechnology VC ecosystem, because that changed to looking for cash flow sustainable companies, which biotechnology companies are. They just run with R&D burn. And it's actually a rather quite capital intensive industry, actually caused a pullback within the industry. And so, consequently, then you've got this, and also the VCs don't always come down. It wasn't really part of their business model to come down so far into funding university research. It has happened, and those that run venture studios. And so now you have a number of these universities stumped on what effectively to do next. Some people I've spoken to have said they've rolled back on a conclusion that they should just chase donors more. And, I know personally that is a very, very tough prospect, whining and dining people. And then, you never know when they're effectively going to arrive at a decision, but the clock is running against you to effectively get money to fund your lab. So it does mean a lot to these researchers. Probably talking about the contribution that DeSci can effectively make here is that you can bring in a whole market structure that can actually help facilitate like some of the most meritorious research to come out. And I actually believe it's much more of a meritorious tool than effectively bringing funding in. It can bring in other types of resources that can actually help you collaborate on the research. And one of the interesting things about the biomedical research ecosystem is the degree of separation amongst all the stakeholders. So, like the researchers may not necessarily know the patients, we will not know the doctors that deal with this. But if you create like a lot of great businesses and innovations are created by like tightening those feedback loops, basically understanding, testing, understanding things very quickly and iterating to effectively move towards the right outcome. And that like DeSci has that degree of tooling to be able to provide that degree of insight to people. And so, I in my recent experiences, I've seen universities like the heads of tech transfer offices and a variety of different people, national bodies that are involved in sort of scientific research jump at the prospect of wanting to understand like what DeSci effectively has to offer. And now they really understand at a point of crisis that there needs to be a broader degree of availability for helping bring this research to life.
Yeah, I spoke on this a little bit at the top of, our episode here, but there is so much changing. And I think before, where DeSci was this thing that I feel like people didn't feel like they needed to figure out because the system was working based on how it was designed. Where now all of a sudden there's some friction in that system. And now DeSci to me is absolutely a solution to help in this situation. And when I say solution, I don't think any of us are, think that system's going away. It's worked. There's certainly some friction in it today, but I think we would all agree that DeSci is just something that should be in the toolkit, having another option. So just as you said, there's donors, there's grants, why not have DeSci as an option in your toolkit? And would be curious if you've heard people becoming more receptive to just even the idea of having more tools in their toolkit.
Oh, entirely. I mean, I've spoken to people who have a huge degree of influence in the industry, and they're very excited for this discussion coming through. And, without saying more, we've spoken to some of the world's top researchers, and, have the prospect of Nobel Prize winners hovering around the ecosystem because they're deeply passionate about seeing the advancement of science. They want to ensure the safe continuity of scientific research and the ability for people to come forward with ideas and really be able to advance them. And so anything that sort of damages that ecosystem, you will get people coming in to effectively protect it. Not only people that made their careers out of it, but it's a love for so many people. And in that way, it's, I've been absolutely astounded at some of the support that we've received and some of the people that will come out with us to effectively try help grow the story of DeSci.
Yeah, I love that you put it that way. Like science is so precious. It honestly is like anyone really working in that field, there's like an ethos and a mission and vision alignment. And there's certainly, I'm sure, people that fall outside of that. But in general, it attracts like a certain type of ethos. And just as that exists in the traditional sector, that ethos is in the DeSci sector. And like you said, is attracting in the top minds. And honestly, like giving them a substrate to run, where I feel like they can more unrestrained, like go after the areas that they're interested in. They don't have to maybe shape to get this grant, I need to tweak the thing that I want to research in this way to get the money. So, I think the long-term vision of DeSci is to like really attract in those minds, but also give them the runway, the flexibility, the tools, and the collaboration to go after the science that they want to go after in an unadulterated way.
Well, I mean, the way I really see it is you're taking one really motivated individual and you're introducing them to a group of other motivated individuals. They just happen to share the same interest. I've spoken to like a number of researchers over the years, and they tell me that it can be a really lonely place when you're like only one of 17 people in the world that can that just can really understand like a certain element of scientific research or inquiry. But when you, with DeSci, when it like looks at enhancing the story and the narrative that sits around what you're doing, and you have the ability to effectively articulate the merits of it and find your community and find your people around it, that's real purpose. And so this is like one of the bigger elements that I see around this is that over the last few years, there has been a little bit of a breakdown in the relationship between what I would call scientific experts, that's not necessarily researchers, but, respectively people in the public health policy side of things, and also just the general public. And now what DeSci is providing is it's providing the bridge of understanding between various communities where people can actually come into understanding the scientific method. They can come into understanding the rigorous application of these methodologies, and just how a number of these discoveries are effectively evaluated, and what they mean to people and what they mean to society.
For sure. I hate to bring it all the way back to social media, but I as a user am seeing this like more and more every single day, like the topics that are showing up on my feed, the guests that are going on different podcasts, the experts that we're hearing from that, I feel like people thought that people didn't want to know the science or didn't want to know what was going on and just maybe wanted like the end product. Honestly, I totally agree with you, Aaron. It's a flip. Like people want to know what's going on, want to know how we got here. I think some of I'm a Joe Rogan fan. I think even some of the guests that are on Joe Rogan, like the topics that he's bringing in are making, that he's making mainstream conversations. Like he wouldn't be doing that if people weren't interested. And now, when I think about what's landing in my feed, there's a ton of science and a ton of like people wanting access to the data, wanting substrate to be able to experiment, learn, figure out what's going on. So you said it really eloquently, like it really is a bridge to connecting people to scientific purpose on both sides, like researchers to engage communities and patients and people who want to be connected to the actual science. But it's that bridge to purpose on both sides that I think we can finally have, where, maybe we weren't ready for it 40 or 50 years ago, but man, today I feel like people want this stuff at their fingertips. And some of it's probably driven by tech, having, Apple Watches and Aura rings that monitor your biometrics and wanting to know, like, what does this data mean? Or AI that can process it. I mean, there's so much more tools that we have as consumers that can process the information and get to that really like personalized medicine, personalized healthcare that I don't like have to necessarily go to a doctor to like get some of that information. I can filter through it myself and come to that conversation informed in a way that I really couldn't have even 5 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, it's making people a participant in really managing their health. And so, I think the old sort of healthcare paradigm was, it's always been described as one of sick care. And so it's like the state provides for you, the health insurance company provides for you. It sort of set a broader base like behavioral trait where it was people outsourced their effectively their health management in a way. And now we've moved to this generational sort of like reskilling, like understanding your core physiology, health, bits of health optimization, et cetera. But, in the end, it allows you to live a healthier life. It allows you to be more productive. You can have more time with family and friends, all of this. And, even if you look at the prospective sort of futuristic forecasts of having AI doctors and things of the sort, it's, you still have to discern and take that knowledge and information in and figure out effectively what to do with it. You'll have greater touch points there. So we are moving in the direction of a much more educated scientific public, and particularly people grasping like the various medical concepts.
Yeah, definitely. I think people got tired. People got sick and tired of being sick and tired, honestly, and just wanted to take some of that power and put it back in their hands. And coming back around to, where we started, this is why these funding cuts and these budget implications matter, because if that early science isn't being done, that foundational science isn't being done, it has real implications for you as a user, right? Because you are the one who's ultimately going to benefit from the science being done. So if it's not being done, then at the end of the day, that could be a breakthrough or a diagnostic or foundational knowledge that, leads to the next AI breakthrough that isn't going to get to you or is going to be delayed in getting to you. So we absolutely should be continuing to have, these open conversations about what it means. And, one thing I would love to ask you is, for people that are hearing this and, maybe just starting to hear it for the first time, or who have heard about the cuts and didn't really understand what it means, is there anything that they can do? Or, in the conversations that you've had with people, is there anything that would be helpful in terms of like activating the public in a more meaningful way?
I think it is actually really trying to help grow the course for DeSci. What this whole situation sort of illustrates is maybe a growing degree of political uncertainty. And by the way, it's not just in the United States itself. When I speak to certain political figures, the only prediction they have rolling forward is just increasing political uncertainty, and so various sort of like spectrum shifts. And effectively, what I'd be happy with, if you care deeply for the advancement of science, support the ecosystem, come in, get to know about it, talk to your friends about it, find projects you effectively want to support, because this can be a resilient market-based structure for the advancement of the next number of scientific breakthroughs, and make science for the people in this respect, so that the people can effectively push forward what they want to see.
Yeah, at Molecule, we say the future of science belongs to everyone. And now it really can belong and be put in your hands, and you can play an active role in that. So I echo your sentiment, Aaron, on getting involved. If you don't know how to get involved, Molecule has some great resources. We've kicked off an education program just for people who want to learn. So whether you're a student, a researcher, someone looking for funding, or someone looking just to learn about what the DeSci movement is in general, check out Molecule's DeSci EDU. It is a great program just to find a way into the ecosystem, but hop into our community. As Aaron mentioned earlier, we all have the same ethos. We all are aligned to the same mission, vision, and want to help connect people to purpose. So if you are passionate about science or passionate about what's going on with budget cuts, there is a place for you in DeSci, and we're happy to help you find it. But Aaron, thank you so much. I know that there's probably a lot we can unpack, and honestly, I'll probably have you back on for some more deeper dives, because I think, as we all have seen, this is changing a bit day over day. And so this is certainly, a quick recap of what's happened in the last few months, but it's not to say that there won't be changes tomorrow. So would love to keep you close. You are the beating heart of, what's going on the ground, and would love to just continue to educate and inform people around that. Folks listening, if you have questions or topics you want us to cover in this area, please drop them in the comments. We'll have Aaron back on, or certain guests, to help answer your questions. But want to thank you again for popping on. You have made this so much clearer in terms of what's going on. You've made the impact of what it means crystal clear. And yeah, you're really showing us what's happening behind the scenes.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Again, for folks, drop in your comments if there's topics you want us to cover. And yeah, get involved into DeSci. We'd love to have you. Bye, guys.